100,000 captives, entire cities emptied, their names erased, their children marched in chains across the burning plains of Mesopotamia. Picture it. The year is 700 BC. The Assyrian army has just taken another rebel capital. Within days, the streets run silent except for the sound of iron on stone. Soldiers carving the king Es triumph into the walls. Skins are flayed, heads are stacked, and the message is carved deep enough to last 3 millennia. This is what happens when you defy Assyria. Now imagine that power in today's world. A single city-state commanding half the known population of the planet. An army that doesn't just win battles, it erases civilizations. That was the Assyrian Empire at its height, the first true superpower of the Iron Age. Its capital, Nineveh, held more people than London would until the 18th century. Its walls stretched 12 kilometers, its gates named for gods older than writing itself. From the mountains of Anatolia to the sands of Egypt, everyone lived under the shadow of its kings. Yet behind that glittering facade lay a truth modern empires still fear. Absolute power demands absolute violence to survive. Every stone of Nineveh was mortared with fear. Every conquest was a performance, terror as statecraft, recorded in cuneiform and relief. The Assyrians didn't just wage war, they industrialized it. Iron weapons, siege engines, chariots with spoked wheels, archers firing in organized ranks, the hardware of domination refined to a science. Their kings understood propaganda long before the word existed. Reliefs showed rivers of prisoners, lions brought to heel, divine figures granting victory. Each campaign began with ritual, the king consulting oracles, invoking Asher, god of war and empire, then marching at the head of tens of thousands. No democracy debated these wars. No senate questioned them. The Assyrian king was the state, the general, and the priest. When he breathed, empires trembled. But the irony is ancient. The same brutality that built Assyria would one day tear it apart. Every conquered people remembered the flames. Every vassal waited for weakness. Every god they destroyed would one day rise in vengeance through those who survived. Before that reckoning, though, came centuries of unstoppable ascent. The story begins not with Nineveh's glory, but with a provincial town beside the Tigris, rebuilding after collapse. Around 1200 BC, the Bronze Age world ended in chaos. Great kingdoms fell to famine, invasion, and climate disaster. Egypt retreated behind its deserts. The Hittites vanished. Mycenae burned. Out of that silence, the Assyrians learned the lesson that would define them. When the world falls apart, the ruthless inherit the earth. Their kings reorganized everything: land, labor, law. They turned agriculture into taxation, taxation into soldiers, soldiers into conquest. By 900 BC, Assyria was rising again under Ashur-nasir-pal II. He moved his capital to a new city, Kalhu, modern Nimrud, and filled it with palaces, libraries, and sculptures so vast they intimidated the gods themselves. He called himself the splendid flame who consumes the lands. His inscriptions describe mountains dyed red with blood and rivers clogged with corpses. Scholars debate exaggeration, but the logic is clear. To rule through fear, you must make cruelty visible. Each successor learned from him. Shalmaneser III expanded west toward the Mediterranean, confronting coalitions of Aramaean and Israelite kings. Tiglath-Pileser III reformed the army into a permanent professional machine. Iron-armed, centrally supplied, marching year-round. Deportations became policy. Conquered peoples were uprooted and scattered to prevent rebellion. It was demographic warfare centuries before the term existed. By the time Sargon II seized the throne in 722 BC, the Assyrian Empire was more than a kingdom. It was a system. Roads radiated from Nineveh like arteries. Messengers carried tablets bearing royal orders that could cross a continent in days. Governors ruled provinces measured in weeks of travel. The Assyrian state was bureaucratic, literate, and terrifyingly efficient. And for a moment in human history, it worked. Pause and imagine standing on those walls at sunset, looking out over the Tigris. You'd see caravans stretching to the horizon, tribute flowing in from Egypt, Phoenicia, and Babylon. You'd hear scribes reciting lists of captured kings, craftsmen chiseling immortal boasts into alabaster. You'd feel the certainty that this empire would last forever. Every empire feels that way, right before the fall. By the middle of the 8th century BC, Assyria was no longer a kingdom among others. It was the empire others feared becoming. At its heart stood a weapon the world had never seen before, a standing army that existed even in peacetime. Tiglath-Pileser III built it piece by piece. He took a tribal militia and forged a professional force of iron. Soldiers drilled year-round. Craftsmen worked in state armories producing standardized weapons and chariots. Engineers designed siege ramps and movable towers. Even logistics were centralized. Grain depots, fodder stations, riverside ports. Every detail planned so the army could march in any season, in any direction. This was not chaos. It was organization raised to terror. Each unit had defined ranks, scribes to record supplies, and officers chosen for loyalty. Soldiers came from across the empire, Assyrians at the core, conquered peoples serving in specialized roles. The empire fought as one machine, its fuel human obedience. The Assyrians invented something the modern world takes for granted: the state's monopoly on violence. No warlords, no private armies. Only the king could authorize destruction, and once authorized, it was absolute. The campaigns of Tiglath-Pileser read like blueprints for industrial warfare. In 743 BC, he crushed a coalition in Syria. Cities that resisted were leveled, their populations deported, their names erased. In 732, Damascus fell after 2 years of siege. The king of Israel became a vassal. The tribes of the north were carried off into exile, vanishing into history's margins. Their disappearance would echo in later scriptures as the lost tribes. Assyrian warfare had rules, but mercy was not among them. When cities submitted peacefully, tribute was taken: gold, silver, horses, and craftsmen. When they resisted, they ceased to exist. The king's annals describe it without shame. I cut their throats like lambs. I built a pillar over their city gates with their heads. To the Assyrians, such declarations weren't brutality. They were deterrence. Propaganda was as vital as victory. Every campaign produced stone reliefs showing enemies begging for mercy, kings kneeling, fortresses crumbling. These weren't decorations. They were news bulletins carved in stone, messages to every province: rebellion brings annihilation. But behind the horror lay genius. The Assyrians pioneered techniques that defined warfare for centuries. They mastered siegecraft, battering rams, sappers tunneling under walls, archers covering engineers. They used cavalry not as scouts, but as decisive shock troops, replacing chariots on the open plains. They built the first organized intelligence networks: spies, scouts, and informants, feeding reports to Nineveh. Administration matched the army's precision. The empire was divided into provinces, each ruled by a governor responsible for tribute, labor, and loyalty. Standardized weights, measures, and law codes kept the system coherent. Roads allowed orders to travel at astonishing speed. The entire imperial apparatus existed to support the army, and the army existed to preserve the apparatus. By the reign of Sargon II, Assyria's expansion became unstoppable momentum. He defeated Urartu in the north, subdued the Philistines in the west, and captured the wealthy city of Samaria. In 710 BC, he turned south and conquered Babylon, the heart of ancient Mesopotamia. To rule Babylon was to rule civilization itself. Sargon called himself King of the Four Corners of the World. It wasn't a metaphor, it was policy. The empire that emerged from his conquests stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. No power on earth could match its reach or speed. But for all its iron discipline, the empire had an invisible weakness. It depended entirely on the fear of the king's presence. When that presence faltered, the machinery broke. In 705 BC, Sargon died on campaign in Anatolia. His body was never recovered. For the Assyrians, it was more than tragedy. It was cosmic imbalance. A king who ruled by divine right couldn't simply vanish. Rumors spread that the gods had abandoned him. Soldiers whispered of bad omens. Superstition infected the ranks of an army built on fear and obedience. His successor, Sennacherib, faced rebellion almost immediately. Babylon rose again. Judea defied tribute. Egypt stirred. Yet Sennacherib was not a man to hesitate. If his father had built the empire, he would burn the world to keep it. In 701 BC, he marched west with nearly 200,000 men. His army stormed 46 cities in Judah, including Lachish, whose destruction was immortalized in sculpted panels still preserved today. The reliefs show archers firing, rams battering gates, captives impaled before the walls. Each detail is precise, methodical, and cold. When he reached Jerusalem, the city resisted. Biblical accounts describe a siege where plague or divine intervention saved the defenders. Assyrian records simply say the king shut up Hezekiah like a bird in a cage. Whether through luck, disease, or tribute, Jerusalem survived. But Sennacherib had made his point. He returned to Babylon to face rebellion once more. This time he abandoned mercy entirely. The city that had been the cradle of civilization was razed to its foundations. Temples destroyed, idols melted, citizens slaughtered. His inscriptions boast, "I made its streets like a floodplain." Babylon, the eternal rival of Assyria, was gone. No one had ever done such a thing before. Erase a holy city. The shock reverberated across the known world. Priests cursed his name. Scholars called it sacrilege. But to Sennacherib, it was simple arithmetic. Terror sustains power, and fear renews loyalty. For a time, it worked. The empire reached its greatest size, its capital Nineveh transformed into a city of gardens, aqueducts, and colossal palaces. Yet each conquest carried the seed of its undoing. The farther Assyria expanded, the more enemies it created. The iron machine that devoured kingdoms was consuming itself. Its manpower drained, its provinces restless, its kings paranoid. Every empire believes efficiency can replace legitimacy. Every tyrant mistakes silence for loyalty. Sennacherib had rebuilt the empire on blood and spectacle. What he didn't know was that his own palace would soon echo with that same violence. Turned inward. Power always turns inward. Sennacherib learned that truth not from an enemy's sword, but from the hands of his own sons. After decades of conquest, he returned to Nineveh in triumph, an old man surrounded by monuments of terror. He had burned Babylon to dust, drowned rebels in their own rivers, and carved his victories into stone for eternity. Yet eternity is shorter than it seems. In 681 BC, Sennacherib entered the temple of Ninurta to pray. As he knelt before the god, two of his sons approached from behind and cut him down. The annals go silent. The empire that had been built on fear had devoured its master. Assyria should have collapsed then, torn apart by succession wars and divine panic. Instead, from that chaos emerged a man the ancients called the Healer, Esarhaddon, Sennacherib's younger son. He killed his brothers, seized the throne, and began the delicate work of resurrecting an empire stained by its own crimes. His first act was both political and symbolic. He rebuilt Babylon. The city his father had turned to ash rose again under his supervision, brick by brick, as an offering to the gods and a gesture to the world that Assyria could create as well as destroy. For the first time in generations, the empire's art and architecture spoke not only of fear, but of reconciliation. Esarhaddon understood that fear alone was brittle. He sought legitimacy through mercy and spectacle. He issued decrees protecting the weak, rebuilt temples, and restored trade routes that had withered under endless campaigns. He also did something few Assyrian kings had ever done. He planned succession carefully. His heir, Ashurbanipal, was chosen not for seniority, but for intellect. Educated, literate, and ambitious, the young prince would turn Assyria into something the world had never seen. An empire of knowledge and war intertwined. When Esarhaddon died in 669 BC, on campaign in Egypt, Ashurbanipal ascended the throne. He inherited a state that spanned from the Nile to the mountains of Iran. Its armies were still unmatched, its bureaucracies humming, its cities rich with tribute. Yet the young king wanted more than conquest. He wanted immortality. Ashurbanipal called himself King of the Universe, and for a time, it was true. He fought like a soldier, but thought like a scholar. In Nineveh, he created what historians now call the world's first great library, a collection of over 30,000 clay tablets inscribed with texts on medicine, astronomy, history, and magic. He ordered scribes to copy everything worth preserving from Babylon, Sumer, and beyond. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the story of the flood, the hymns to forgotten gods, all of them survived because Ashurbanipal demanded it. To his contemporaries, he was the perfect ruler, ruthless in war, divine in wisdom. But the same brilliance that built his legacy also magnified his paranoia. He surrounded himself with omens and astrologers, demanding constant confirmation that the gods favored him. When rebellion erupted, he answered with the full fury of the Assyrian war machine. Egypt fell to him twice. Elam, Persia's predecessor, was obliterated. Its cities were burned, its king flayed, its statues shattered. The rivers of southern Iran ran red, and the Assyrian scribes recorded it proudly. I destroyed the ziggurat. I tore down the temples. I carried away their gods as captives. Every campaign was both a military operation and a religious ritual. Victory meant divine approval. Defeat meant cosmic disorder. The king's face appeared on steles across the empire, standing tall as gods bowed beside him. In the reliefs of Nineveh, he is shown hunting lions. Each arrow, each spear, a metaphor for his dominion over chaos itself. The lions die beautifully, caught in eternal agony, their sculpted bodies arching in pain. Ashurbanipal saw himself as more than mortal. His writings call him beloved of Ishtar, wise as Ea, strong as Ninurta. To question his rule was to challenge the gods. Yet beneath the grandeur lay the same sickness that had plagued every Assyrian ruler before him, the need for fear to sustain control. As his empire reached its zenith, it also reached its limit. The constant wars drained resources. Provinces grew weary of endless tribute. The deportations that had once stabilized the empire now scattered loyalty too thin to sustain. Assyria's enemies had learned its tactics and were preparing to use them in reverse. Still, within Nineveh's walls, none of that seemed possible. The city glowed at night with oil lamps reflecting off alabaster. Gardens irrigated by aqueducts bloomed in desert air. Courtiers whispered poetry to the sound of harps. The empire's libraries overflowed with texts no one would ever finish reading. It was civilization at its most complete and its most fragile. Ashurbanipal would outlive most of his enemies, dying in his palace sometime after 631 BC. His death marked the beginning of the end. Without his authority, the empire became a mosaic of rival generals, jealous governors, and restless provinces. The machinery of conquest began to rust from within. Assyria had conquered the world with discipline, intelligence, and terror. Now those same tools would turn on themselves. The empire that called itself eternal had a decade left to live. Empires don't simply fall. They spend years pretending they still stand. By the last quarter of the 7th century BC, Assyria had become a monument kept alive by habit. The statues were still polished, the royal decrees still written in flawless cuneiform, but the heartbeat behind them had slowed. What had once been discipline had hardened into routine, and routine is the beginning of decay. The empire that had conquered the world now struggled to command its own provinces. Governors ignored summons. Tribute caravans vanished. Armies still marched, but they marched against one another. The discipline that had terrified continents now tore the empire from within. The death of Ashurbanipal had left a vacuum no one could fill. His sons, grandsons, and generals fought for the throne, each claiming the favor of the gods, none able to hold it. In the confusion, the subject nations remembered their dead. The Babylonians who had seen their city burned. The Medes, whose mountains had been plundered. The Scythians, whose horsemen had once served as Assyrian mercenaries, all saw a chance to return the pain. Assyria's frontier garrisons sent frantic tablets north toward Nineveh. Rebellion in the south, raids in the east, supplies exhausted. Each message traveled more slowly than the last. The roads the empire had once mastered were breaking apart. The couriers still wore the king's seal, but by the time they reached the capital, their news was weeks old and already worse. By 616 BC, Babylon and Media had become allies, a partnership born from hatred. Nabopolassar, the Babylonian ruler, declared that the gods themselves demanded vengeance. His soldiers carried banners showing Marduk trampling the winged bull of Asher. To the east, Cyaxares of Media gathered mountain tribes and steppe nomads under one purpose: the annihilation of the empire that had enslaved them. Assyria still had armies, disciplined, drilled, but half their strength gone and their confidence broken. They fought defensively now, retreating from city to city, watching their own fortresses become tombs. In 614 BC, the allied armies reached Asher, the oldest and holiest of Assyria's capitals. For nearly a millennium, every coronation had begun there, every conquest had been blessed within its temples. The Medes stormed the walls after a brief siege and destroyed everything inside. They slaughtered priests at their altars, toppled the god Asher's statue, and left the city a skeleton of blackened stone. The empire that had begun in Asher now witnessed its own heart stop beating. When news reached Nineveh, people still refused to believe it. How could the city that had burned Babylon and humbled Egypt ever fall? They told themselves the gods were testing them, that the flood of omens would pass. But omens are only ignored by those already doomed. In 612 BC, the coalition marched north to the final prize: Nineveh, the jewel of Mesopotamia. Walls 40 feet thick, encircling an area so vast that farms grew inside them. Gardens fed by aqueducts, palaces decorated with ivory and lapis, libraries filled with the wisdom of ages. Even the invaders hesitated for a moment, staring at a city that looked immortal. The siege began in the spring. Babylonian records describe 3 months of relentless assault. Siege ramps climbed the walls. Archers darkened the sky. Engineers dragged battering rams across the flooded plain, building causeways through mud and corpses. Inside, King Sin-Shar-Ishkun rallied his remaining troops. He had nowhere to retreat, nothing to surrender, and no allies to save him. Nineveh's defenses were formidable, but even stone has limits. The Tigris River that had sustained the city turned traitor. Heavy rains swelled its banks, undermining sections of the walls. Babylonian chronicles say, the river opened its mouth and tore a breach wide enough for the enemy to pour through. The same water that had nourished the empire became the instrument of its death. What followed was 3 days of slaughter that ended an age. The Medes and Babylonians fought street by street, cutting down defenders and civilians alike. Fire spread through the marketplaces, feeding on oils and timber, until the entire horizon glowed red. The palace of Sennacherib, once a symbol of unstoppable power, collapsed in a thunder of flame, burying its reliefs under tons of debris. Ancient witnesses wrote that the noise of the burning could be heard miles away. Nineveh's towers fell one by one, throwing sparks into a sky already dark with smoke. The heat was so intense that bronze fittings melted into pools, fusing with ash and stone. Thousands drowned in the river trying to escape. Others barricaded themselves in temples, choosing to burn with their gods rather than live to see captivity. The conquerors looted everything they could carry: gold, silver, ivory carvings, jewelry pulled from the dead. Tablets from Ashurbanipal's library were scattered through the ruins, many baked into permanence by the same fire that destroyed the city. The invaders didn't know they were preserving the past, even as they annihilated it. When the fires died, nothing remained but silence. Nineveh, city of kings, capital of the world, was gone. Her conquerors divided the ashes. Babylonia took the south, Media the north. The Assyrians who survived fled west to Haran and tried to rebuild a court among ruins. But without walls, treasury, or faith, their empire was a ghost already fading. To the outside world, the fall of Nineveh was justice long delayed. Neighboring kingdoms that had lived in terror for generations saw divine order restored. Prophets in Judah and Israel sang of vengeance. Because of the multitude of thy whoredoms, the mistress of witchcrafts, I will lift thy skirts over thy face. For the first time, the world rejoiced at the destruction of an empire. But history rarely grants clean endings. Babylon, the chief architect of Assyria's destruction, would rule barely 70 years before meeting the same fate at the hands of Persia. The torch of empire passed on, each successor convinced it could avoid the same pattern. None ever did. Archaeologists would rediscover Nineveh in the 1840s. Beneath mounds near Mosul, they uncovered the palaces of Sennacherib and Ashurbanipal, their reliefs still sharp, their inscriptions still proud. The flames had baked them hard as brick. The city's library yielded the stories of Gilgamesh, of creation and flood, the myths that survived because the destroyers hadn't known they were sparing them. The irony is perfect. The same empire that erased cultures preserved them. The same fires that ended Nineveh sealed its words for eternity. From its ashes came the first lesson every civilization must relearn. Fear builds quickly, but crumbles faster than stone. The Assyrians had believed terror could outlast time. Instead, it wrote their epitaph. When the fires of Nineveh went out, the world felt quieter. No empire rose to replace Assyria immediately. The land itself seemed to exhale after centuries of screaming. The Tigris drifted past blackened stones, carrying ash downstream toward the Persian Gulf. Where there had been soldiers, there were jackals. Where there had been kings, there were only names carved in half-melted clay. For the first time in living memory, the Near East existed without a master. The terror that had bound a continent vanished, leaving space for something else. Hope or chaos, depending on who you asked. The Assyrian Empire had been so vast that its absence created a vacuum no single power could fill. Trade routes fractured, cities declared independence, and the survivors picked through ruins that still smoldered. Babylon took the mantle first. Nabopolassar's son, Nebuchadnezzar II, rebuilt the southern city with the wealth of conquest. He raised ziggurats to scrape the sky, temples glazed in blue and gold, and a palace so vast it consumed entire neighborhoods. The Ishtar Gate, its bricks the color of twilight, its beasts frozen mid-step, became the face of a reborn world. Babylon declared itself heir to all that had been Assyria, but its tone was different. Where the Assyrians had ruled through terror, Babylon ruled through spectacle. The empire of fear had given birth to the empire of wonder. Yet the bones beneath the beauty were Assyrian. Babylonian kings inherited more than land. They inherited bureaucracy, military systems, even language. The Aramaic script that Assyrian administrators had spread across continents became the lingua franca of the region. Assyrian siegecraft, their logistics, their provincial governments, all became the model for those who followed. The tools of empire survived their makers. The new rulers also inherited Assyria's ghosts. Every city they occupied had memories of flaying fields and burning temples. Generations had grown up beneath Assyrian whips. You cannot erase fear that deep. It lingers like smoke in stone. The Babylonians tried to replace it with grandeur, hanging gardens, canals, libraries. But the shadow of Nineveh remained. To the west, the people of Judah, once crushed beneath Assyrian boots, now found themselves under Babylon's watch. They celebrated at first, seeing in Assyria's fall the hand of divine justice. But empires learn quickly. Within a generation, Babylon repeated the pattern. Demands for tribute, deportations, and finally destruction. Jerusalem fell in 586 BC. Its temple burned. Its people were marched east in chains. The cycle had begun again, only with a different flag. To the east, the Medes ruled the highlands for a time, their victory over Nineveh giving them prestige but little cohesion. Their confederation was powerful, not permanent. From their ranks would emerge a man whose empire would eclipse them all, Cyrus of Persia. He learned from every ruin around him, Assyria's efficiency, Babylon's wealth, Media's mobility, and turned those lessons into the Persian system, a model so balanced it would outlast them all. Cyrus understood what Assyria had not. You cannot rule forever by fear alone. Conquered peoples will serve more faithfully when offered dignity. The Persians would conquer with armies, but they would govern with tolerance. They built on Assyria's infrastructure, the same roads, the same relay systems, but replaced brutality with order. Where Assyria deported, Persia repatriated. Where Assyria destroyed temples, Persia rebuilt them. The Empire of Iron had taught the Empire of Mercy how not to rule. Still, history is not sentimental. The Persians, too, would fade. Then Greece would rise. Then Rome. Each studied the Assyrian model, its discipline, its logistics, its propaganda, and each borrowed what suited them. When Roman engineers paved their roads, they followed Assyrian routes. When emperors carved triumphs into marble, they echoed the reliefs of Nineveh. When generals boasted of divine favor, they were imitating words first written on clay 3,000 years before. Assyria became a blueprint, an ancient ghost hiding behind the banners of every conqueror who followed. Even its language lived on. Aramaic, the dialect spread by Assyrian scribes, would later become the tongue of empires, prophets, and merchants. It was the language spoken by Jesus, the same syllables once shouted by Assyrian generals across battlefields. The empire died, but its voice endured. Yet for all its influence, the memory of Assyria twisted with time. To the descendants of its victims, it was a monster, biblical, cursed, the bloody city of Nahum's prophecy. To later historians, it became a warning about the dangers of despotism. Only with archaeology did another picture emerge, not just an empire of war, but of art, science, and record-keeping. When 19th century explorers uncovered the palaces of Nimrud and Nineveh, they were stunned. The scale defied belief. Reliefs 20 feet wide, inscriptions so dense they covered entire walls, thousands of tablets stacked like bricks. In those layers of ash lay humanity's first organized libraries. Inside them were star charts, medical manuals, epic poetry, even legal documents describing loans and property rights. Beneath the cruelty, there had been order. Beneath the tyranny, administration. Each discovery forced the modern world to admit an uncomfortable truth. Civilization and brutality often share the same foundation. The same bureaucratic precision that kept armies fed also kept slaves accounted for. The same literacy that preserved the Epic of Gilgamesh also recorded mass deportations. The line between progress and oppression was thin even then. Today, the ruins of Nineveh sit near the modern city of Mosul. In recent decades, they've suffered again: war, looting, explosions. Statues that survived 2,600 years have been smashed by new zealots convinced they were erasing idols. The same story plays out in different centuries. Power rises, power falls, and the monuments of yesterday become the targets of tomorrow. Assyria's lesson remains unlearned. Still, something endures. In museums from London to Baghdad, the faces of Assyrian kings stare from carved alabaster, bearded, proud, eternal. Their eyes are wide and calm, the way only those who thought themselves immortal could look. They cannot speak, but their silence says enough. They remind us that the march of civilization has always carried the sound of boots. Look closely at those reliefs, and you'll see two histories carved into one surface. Victory parades and burning cities, scholars with styluses beside soldiers with spears. One hand-built, the other destroyed. Together they defined empire. Assyria's fall was not the end of an age. It was the prototype of all that followed. The idea that order can be engineered through fear, that progress can coexist with cruelty, that knowledge alone does not save a people from themselves. Every empire since has tested that theory, and everyone has failed in time. Nineveh's walls are dust now. The Tigris still runs beside them, indifferent. But the tablets that survived the flames still speak. They whisper of kings who called themselves divine, and of scribes who wrote the first words for war, peace, and debt. They remind us that civilization's foundations are never innocent. History doesn't repeat, It remembers. The ashes of Nineveh lie beneath our own cities, in the architecture of our governments, the language of our bureaucracy, the quiet belief that order justifies anything. The Assyrians believed the same. They thought they were permanent. Every empire does. Iron. It built their weapons, their walls, their empire. It turned the soft Bronze Age of kings into the hard age of conquerors. But the same metal that forged Assyria's glory also defined its fate. Iron is strong, but it rusts from within. When we speak of Assyria now, we speak of shadows carved in stone, bearded kings, winged bulls, endless processions of captives. Their faces are expressionless, but the message is unmistakable. Power without restraint becomes its own religion. The Assyrians did not invent cruelty, but they made it systematic. They turned violence into policy and fear into architecture. For a time, it worked perfectly. The story of Assyria is the story of control, of how far a civilization can go when it replaces morality with efficiency. Every soldier, every scribe, every engineer served one will: the king's. The result was breathtaking in its precision and horrifying in its intent. Armies marched according to tablets that recorded the weight of every chariot wheel, the rations for every mule. Provinces were catalogued, populations relocated, rebels erased. Even the gods became administrators of empire. And yet, for all its order, Assyria fell faster than anyone believed possible. The machine stopped not because an enemy outsmarted it, but because its gears had eaten themselves. The empire had built an entire civilization on the assumption that terror could be permanent, that if people feared enough, they would never rebel again. But fear decays. It burns bright, then dies, leaving only ashes and memory. When the Medes and Babylonians breached Nineveh, they didn't just conquer a city. They revealed the weakness hidden inside every absolute power, that the moment people stop believing in its inevitability, it ends. The same soldiers who had once crushed rebellions now fought without conviction. The same gods who had promised protection fell silent. Power collapsed not in battle, but in the human mind. Assyria's kings believed they could master fate through control. They measured the heavens, calculated eclipses, catalogued omens. They thought if they could predict the stars, they could command destiny itself. But destiny is indifferent. It moves with or without permission. The gods they worshipped were reflections of themselves, brilliant, violent, insecure. Look at their reliefs today, and you can almost feel the rhythm of the empire's heartbeat. Panels of conquest followed by panels of ceremony. War, then celebration. Killing, then cataloging. Civilization recorded its own contradictions in real time. Each scene carved for eternity, as if stone could make permanence real. But nothing made by fear lasts forever. The irony is ancient and perfect. Assyria believed itself immortal, and that belief ensured its death. When a power begins to worship its own strength, it stops listening to truth. That was Nineveh's real downfall. Not the flood, not the siege, but the silence that comes when no one dares speak the truth to a throne. Every empire since has followed the same pattern with new tools. Rome replaced the chariot with the legion. Britain replaced the chisel with the map. The modern world replaced the tablet with the screen. But the logic remains unchanged. Control information, project fear, claim eternity. Assyria would recognize it instantly. The ruins of Nineveh are not just an archaeological site, they are a mirror. The same stone that once recorded kings' victories now testifies to their absence. Tourists walk the streets where Sennacherib once rode, where Ashurbanipal's scholars once sorted tablets by category. The ground is silent, but the air remembers. It remembers the smoke, the cries, the iron. When you stand before those reliefs, the ones showing prisoners with ropes through their lips, soldiers marching in perfect rows, you're looking at the first visual language of propaganda. The Assyrians invented it to outlast death. And in a way, they succeeded. Their empire is gone, but their image remains, etched into the memory of civilization as the symbol of ruthless power. They wanted to be remembered. They were. Just not the way they imagined. The lesson of iron is simple and merciless. Strength alone is temporary. It blinds, then betrays. It seduces rulers into thinking they have mastered time, when in truth they have only delayed it. The Assyrians conquered everything except the future. There's another lesson, quieter but harder to ignore. For all their brutality, the Assyrians also preserved the stories of those they conquered. They copied the Sumerian myths, archived Babylonian wisdom, catalogued celestial knowledge that would later guide Greek and Islamic astronomy. Even in their cruelty, they served history. Civilization advanced through their contradictions, the scholar beside the soldier, the scribe beside the executioner. It's uncomfortable, but it's true. Progress has never been innocent. Perhaps that's why the story of Assyria still feels modern. Every age builds its own Nineveh, a system too powerful to imagine failing, too organized to doubt itself. Every generation believes it has learned from history while repeating its pattern in higher resolution. Iron becomes steel, steel becomes silicon, but the logic remains. Power expands until it breaks its own frame. Imagine the end of Nineveh again. Not the flames or the swords, but the quiet after. The smell of wet ash, the crackle of cooling stone, the wind carrying soot across a river that no longer glows red. Somewhere beneath that silence, in the ruins of a library, a clay tablet survives, its lines pressed by a hand that believed its words would be eternal. It was right. We're still reading them. Empires die, but their data survives. The Assyrians wrote on clay because they wanted permanence. The irony is that the clay endured, but the people didn't. Thousands of years later, we scroll through the same lesson in another medium. Everything recorded outlives the one who records it. History doesn't ask for repentance, only recognition. The fall of Assyria is not a moral fable. It's a mirror for every system that mistakes dominance for destiny. The kings of Nineveh believed that they were chosen by gods to rule forever. Every empire since has found its own gods to justify the same delusion. Divine right, progress, civilization, profit. The words change. The belief doesn't. Assyria's ruins whisper the same warning Stalingrad once screamed, the same truth every century forgets. Arrogance is unsustainable. Power without conscience devours itself. And when the fire comes, it consumes not only the guilty, but the civilization that allowed them to rule unchecked. The kings of Nineveh called themselves eternal. Today, they are dust beneath the boots of tourists and soldiers. The Tigris still runs, unbothered, washing away what remains of their walls. But their story endures, not as triumph, but as testimony. Every civilization must choose what kind of permanence it seeks. Some carve it in stone. Some write it in code. All of them fade. What remains are the lessons that power built on fear cannot last, that knowledge without empathy is useless, and that iron, no matter how strong, always rusts.